Hi, I'm David. Welcome to A Tale. Once a week on this channel, we tell a true story from history, the kind I stay up too late reading about, told slow enough to fall asleep to. Tonight is a special one, the longest fire this channel has ever lit, and it begins with a fact I have never once managed to get over. There is a bedtime poem, 3,000 years old, and it turned out to be a map. For a very long stretch of the modern age, many of the wisest people in the world doubted that the Iliad was anything more than a beautiful invention. A war that never happened, at a city that never stood, sung by a blind poet who, quite possibly, never lived. And then a handful of stubborn people took the poem seriously, followed it like a treasure map to a low hill in the northwest corner of Turkey, and dug. And inside that hill, city beneath city beneath city, 9 of them deep, they found something. A real fortress, a burned lair, arrowheads and sling stones still lying in heaps, and gold, though the gold turns out to have a twist in it that no novelist would dare. And far away, in the clay filing cabinets of a forgotten empire, scholars later found what may be the city's real name, written down in the right century by people who had never heard a word of Homer. So tonight is a detective story, and every word of it is true. The story of the poem, of the man who may never have existed, and of the lost city everyone called a myth. And because this is our fireside, you get the ending now, up front, before the ship ever leaves the harbor. Here it is, in 3 sentences. The city is real. You can stand on it today. The world behind the poem is real. The palaces and the sea kings, and the writing and the fire, and I will show you exactly how we know. And the one thing that no shovel, in more than a century and a half of digging, has ever proven, is the war itself, the 10 years and the heroes and the famous horse. That is the honest shape of the answer, and the honesty is the whole journey tonight, because this episode makes you one promise above all others. Every claim in it comes graded. All night long, I will tell you plainly which things we know, which things we only think, and which things we simply cannot prove. And I will never blur the line, not once, not even when the legend is prettier. The strange and wonderful thing about this story, as you're about to hear, is that the truth, honestly graded, is grander than the legend ever was. Everything tonight comes from the scholars, the diggers, and the old sources themselves, all of them listed below. There are no ads waiting to wake you. Before we begin, one quiet word. If these nights help you sleep, subscribe now, while your eyes are still open, and tomorrow night will be waiting for you when you need it. A like helps other tired travelers find this fire. That is the whole ask. So settle in, get warm, and let the oldest story in the Western world keep you company. Good night. Close your eyes now, if you like. This is a story, and it is true, and it asks nothing of you except that you lie still and let it happen. And before the first stone of it is laid, take the ending in your hand again, the way you hold a rail on a dark stair. The city is real, the world is real, the war is beyond proving, and nobody tonight will pretend otherwise. And because you know that already, nothing in this whole long night can startle you. The hill will be found. The tablets will speak. The poem will be caught and copied and kept. Every road tonight runs gently downhill to the same quiet place. A shelf where an old book is waiting, and the book always makes it home. And one thing more, because it is the reason this story, of all stories, belongs to bedtime. The Iliad and the Odyssey were night things from the very beginning. They were not made at desks. For centuries before anyone was able to write them down, they lived only in the evening, in the voices of singers, in halls and courtyards lit by fire, performed for people who had finished their work and were leaning back into the dark, exactly as you are now. A poem like this was never meant to be studied with the lights on. It was meant to be heard with your eyes closed, at the end of a day, while somebody kept the fire. So when you let this story carry you down toward sleep tonight, you are not misusing a masterpiece. You are using it precisely as directed, for the first time in a long while. Let the room around you be the hall, and the lamp be the fire, and this voice be the singer's, and drift whenever you are ready. The story knows the way home. It has known it for 3,000 years, and it is in no hurry, and neither are you. Somewhere in the world at this exact minute, someone is lying in bed with the Iliad. Someone always is. It has been read at bedtime, in one language after another, by emperors and by school children, continuously, for well over 2,000 years, and its younger companion the Odyssey right beside it. And that alone, before we say anything else, is worth letting your mind rest on. Almost nothing human lasts 20 centuries. A few walls, a few roads, and these two poems, which are not even objects, which are only patterns of words, and which have outlived every empire that ever copied them. Here is what they are, plainly. 2 long poems in the old Greek tongue, each of them the length of a thick novel, composed in a rolling 6-beat line called the dactylic hexameter, a rhythm with a swell in it, like the sea coming in. The Iliad tells of a few terrible weeks near the end of a 10-year war, fought under the walls of a rich city called Troy, which the poem in its older breath also calls Ilios. The anger of Achilles, swiftest of the Greeks, the grief of kings, the fall that is coming for the city, foretold but not yet arrived. The Odyssey tells what happened after. One man, Odysseus, trying for 10 more years to get home from that war, past monsters and storms and temptations, to an island and a wife and a son, war and homecoming. The 2 oldest stories there are, told at the very beginning of European literature, and told so well that in some ways nobody has ever told them better. And on the cover of both, one name, Homer. No dates, no city, no portrait made from life, just the name and the poems, and a silence around them 3,000 years deep. So the question of tonight comes in 2 halves, and it helps to say them out loud. Who was Homer, if he was anyone at all? And was any of it true? The city, the war, the world of bronze and ships, 2 mysteries, a poet and a place, wrapped around each other like strands of one rope. We will take the poet first, then the city, then the verdict where they meet. Start with something we know, because it is a good solid plank to stand on. The poems are not patchwork. For a long time, scholars wondered whether the Iliad might be a quilt, dozens of short old songs, stitched together by editors into something long. That view has been weighed for 2 centuries, and it has lost. Nearly all scholars now agree that each poem shows one clear overall design, a shape, an architecture, a beginning that knows its own ending, and that whatever the poems are, they are not a loose anthology of unrelated songs. Even the places where scholars do suspect a seam, and there are few, a night raid in the 10th book of the Iliad that many scholars have long suspected was added later, are suspicious precisely because the rest of the poem hangs together so beautifully that a patch shows. The unity is the finding. File one more thing under no. Whatever else they are, the poems grew out of an oral tradition, a way of making verse without writing, older than any written literature in Europe, and the evidence for it is one of the great detective stories of modern scholarship, and it gets its own chapter tonight. But now watch the honesty rails come on, because here is where the record starts to thin. Was there a Homer? one actual person, one mind behind the design? That we cannot prove, and the finest scholars alive disagree about it in the friendliest possible way. And when were the poems fixed in the form we have? There, the serious answers scatter across 600 years, and I want you to hear the scatter, because the scatter itself is the truth. One careful scholar, Richard Janko, measured the poem's language statistically, the way you might date a tree by its rings, and placed both poems in the 700s before the Common Era, the 8th century. Another, Martin West, argued the Iliad could be no earlier than about 660 to 650, half a century later, with the Odyssey following a generation after that, and by a different poet, he thought. And a third, Gregory Nagy, holds that the question itself is slightly wrong, that Homer was less a man than a living tradition, a river of performance that kept moving and reshaping itself, and did not fully harden into a fixed text until as late as the mid-2nd century before the Common Era, in the age of the great librarians. 3 serious answers, spanning 6 centuries. When a question is genuinely open, this fireside says so. This one is open. So hold the poem in your mind the way the scholars hold it. A vast, unified, beautiful thing, certainly grown from an old oral craft, certainly finished by some process we cannot fully see, signed with a name we cannot attach to a face. That is the mystery as it actually stands. And now, let us go and meet the man, or rather, let us go and meet the stories about the man, because the stories are all there ever were. In the ancient world, 7 cities claimed to be the birthplace of Homer, and they argued about it for centuries, politely and otherwise. Smyrna claimed him, Rhodes claimed him, Colophon, Salamis, Chios, Argos, Athens, each of them certain, each of them with a story, and not one of them with a document. 7 cradles and no birth record. That fact alone tells you nearly everything about the search for Homer. By the time anyone thought to ask where the poet came from, the answer was already legend, and every harbor town on the Aegean wanted the legend for itself. The ancient world did not lack for biographies of Homer, mind you. It had about 10 of them, little books that scholars call the Lives, a life of Homer that circulated under the name of the historian Herodotus, though he did not write it, another under the name of Plutarch, though he did not write it either, a famous one called the Certamen, the Contest. The Lives are full of wonderful particulars, names of parents, wanderings, riddles, deathbed scenes, and modern scholarship, weighing them, has reached a verdict that is gentle and firm at the same time. They are mythical constructs, put together centuries after any possible poet, stories about Homer rather than records of him. Not one detail in them can be trusted as biography. And yet, and this is the turn I love, the scholars who say so are quick to add that the Lives are still evidence, real historical evidence, not about the man, but about the love. People do not invent 10 biographies of a nobody. The myth making itself is the fact. By the time Greece was writing books, Homer was already the kind of figure that cities fight over and stories gather around, the way moss gathers on the oldest stone in the wall. Within the 7 cities, the old traditions kept circling back to 2 names above the others, Smyrna and Chios, with Colophon often third. But it is the island of Chios that gives us something better than a claim. It gives us people. On Chios, for centuries, there lived a guild of performers who called themselves the Homeridae, the sons of Homer. That the Homeridae existed is not in doubt, File it under no. The poet Pindar mentions them around 485 before the Common Era, our earliest witness, and calls them singers of stitched words, performers who began their recitals with a prelude to Zeus. Plato mentions them. Isocrates passes along with a straight face that some of the Homeridae used to tell how Helen herself, the Helen, appeared to Homer in a dream. The geographer Strabo records that when the Chians wanted to prove Homer was theirs, they pointed to the Homeridae, the family evidence, walking around alive. These were real people with a real profession. They recited Homer. They carried Homer, generation after generation, the poem passing through them like a family trade. But were they actually his descendants? Blood of his blood? There the ancients themselves argued, and we still have the argument, preserved in an old lexicon. Two early historians, Acusilaus and Hellanicus, said yes, truly his line. A later scholar, Seleucus, said no, a guild that had taken the master's name, the way a workshop takes the founder's sign. Modern scholarship sides, gently, with Seleucus, a professional brotherhood of reciters, real as rain, whose claimed descent from a founding ancestor called Homeros is exactly the kind of pedigree an ancient guild gave itself, an origin story rather than a genealogy. So, the singers, we know. The bloodline, we cannot prove, and most scholars read it as the guild's own legend. If anything, I find the true version lovelier. Whether or not Homer had sons, the poem did. And then there is the most famous thing anyone believes about Homer. The thing you knew before you knew anything else about him. That he was blind. Here, tonight, the fireside must be very clear, because this one has been told as fact for so long that the telling has worn a groove. The blindness is legend. There is no biographical evidence about Homer at all. None. And the blindness comes down to us, not from any record, but from two beautiful seeds inside the poetry itself, and we can point to both of them exactly. The first seed sits in the 8th book of the Odyssey. Odysseus, shipwrecked and nameless, is being feasted in a great hall, and into that hall is led a bard, a court singer named Demodocus, and the poem pauses to tell us about him with unusual tenderness. The muse loved him greatly, and gave him both good and evil, for she took away his eyes, but gave him sweet song. He sings so truly about the Trojan War that Odysseus, hearing his own story sung, pulls his cloak over his face. Since antiquity, readers have wondered the obvious thing. Is this the poet's portrait of himself, slipped into his own poem, the blind singer whose songs are truer than sight? Perhaps. We cannot know. But that blind bard in the firelight is seed number 1. The second seed is even more direct. Among the oldest Greek hymns, there is a hymn to the god Apollo, and near its end the singer speaks to his audience, a chorus of girls on the island of Delos, and asks them, in effect, when a stranger asks you who is the sweetest singer that ever came here, answer him that it is a blind man, and he dwells in rocky Chios, and his songs are supreme for all time to come. There he is, the blind man of rocky Chios, and here's the step that fixed it forever. The historian Thucydides, one of the most careful minds of the ancient world, quoted that very hymn and named its author as Homer himself. If the hymn is Homer's, then the blind man of Chios is Homer, describing Homer, and antiquity largely took it exactly that way, and the picture never faded again. The sightless singer, the rocky island, the song supreme for all time. Modern scholars read those seeds differently. and their reading is worth carrying with you into sleep, because it is somehow larger than the legend. The blind man of Chios, they suggest, following Nagy among others, is best understood as the founder figure of the Homeridae, the ancestor the guild sang of, modeled on Demodocus, the blind bard already inside the poem, and the blindness itself, as one modern classicist has put it, looks like a myth the Greeks made to explain something true and astonishing about these poems, that they were composed without writing, before writing, by memory and voice alone. A sighted man reads, a blind singer holds the whole world in the dark of his head. The blindness is not a fact about a man's eyes. It is a picture of what the poetry is, an emblem the tradition chose for itself, and the ancients even played word games with the name Homeros to match, glossing it as hostage in one telling, and in another reading as the blind one. None of that is evidence. All of it is love. So this is where the first search ends. We went looking for a man, and we found a name with 7 cradles, a guild of self-declared sons, and a portrait made of poetry. What we cannot find is the person. And just as you feel that door closing, another door opens. Because in the 1930s, in the mountains of the Balkans, 2 scholars found something almost better than a person. They found the profession, not a record of how such poems had once been made, long ago. The thing itself, still alive, still singing. That is the next chapter, and it involves 3,500 discs of aluminum. Picture a village somewhere in the mountains of Yugoslavia in the summer of 1935. Evening. Coffee. A room full of working men at the end of the day, farmers and herders and drivers, and among them a singer, a man the region calls a guslar, which is simply its word for what he does. And when the room settles, the guslar begins, and what comes out of him is not a song the way we use the word, 3 minutes and a chorus. What comes out of him is an epic, a poem of heroes and battles and weddings and sieges, hundreds of lines, thousands of lines, rolling on for the whole evening if the evening wants it, in steady chanted verse, made of formulas and flourishes. No page in sight, no page in existence. The song was never written down. It does not need to be. It lives in him, the way a road lives in a man who has walked it all his life. And at the edge of that room, bent over a recording machine that cuts sound into discs of aluminum, sits an American professor named Millman Perry, who believes he is listening to the closest thing on earth to the voice of Homer. Perry was a scholar of Greek at Harvard, and in the 1920s, still a young man, he had done something to the study of Homer that scholars compare to a door opening in what everyone had assumed was a wall. He had looked very hard at the actual verses, at their strange habits that every reader notices and most readers forgive. Why is Achilles so often swift-footed Achilles, even when he is sitting down? Why is the sea so often the wine dark sea, the dawn so often rosy-fingered? Why do the same phrases return hundreds of times, fitted into the same places in the line, like standard cut stones? Readers had always treated that as the poet's style. Perry demonstrated it was the poet's toolbox. The epithets and phrases he showed form a system, vast, economical, and precisely fitted to the meter, a stock of ready-made verse parts from which a singer can build correct lines at speed while performing, the way a mason builds a wall from cut stone without pausing to quarry. And the system, Perry saw, is thrifty as well as vast. For a given need, in a given slot of the verse, the tradition keeps one right piece, one piece for every socket, and almost no waste. A free literary inventor, coining whatever pleased him, would produce variety. He could not help himself. A system like that is not the private style of one literary genius at a desk. It is a craft, an inheritance, polished by generations of singers who composed out loud, in performance, without writing. The conclusion stood the whole field on its head. The Iliad and the Odyssey were not literary works that came to be recited. They were the perfected products of an oral tradition older than any written literature in Europe. And the caution here is Perry's own, and we will keep it. This does not mean no great poet stood at the end of the chain. It means the chain is real, and the poems were not the free invention of a single literate author writing alone. But a theory about singers 3,000 years dead has an obvious problem. The singers are 3,000 years dead. Ancient Homeric recitation was long extinct. No one alive had ever heard verse composed the old way. So Perry did the thing that turned a brilliant argument into knowledge. He went to find a place where the old way was not extinct. In the South Slavic lands, in Yugoslavia, the living tradition of the guslars was still exactly that, alive, and Perry went into the mountains to listen, first in the summer of 1933 with notebooks, and then again with the recording machine. From June of 1934 to September of 1935, assisted in the work by a young scholar named Albert Lord, whose name you should hold on to. What they gathered is one of the great collections in the history of the study of poetry. More than 12,500 texts of songs, most of them taken down in writing, and more than 3,500 aluminum disc recordings of the singers' actual voices, the heroic songs, and the women songs. Besides, the whole sung furniture of a world. The discs sit at Harvard to this day. On them, you can still hear it. Verse being made, not recited, made, line upon line, in real time, by men holding nothing but the tradition. Because that was the discovery. The thing the recordings proved that no argument alone could, how such poems actually live. A guslar does not memorize a fixed text. The way an actor memorizes a script, he learns the craft, the formulas, the scenes, the story shapes, and then every performance he composes the song anew, at full speed, the same story never twice in quite the same words, longer for a generous evening, shorter for a tired one, always correct, always in meter, always his, and always ancient at once. The song is not a thing at all. It is a performance, a river you cannot step in twice. And the moment you understand that, the strangeness of Homer begins to make a new kind of sense. The formulas, the repeated scenes, the epithets, faithful as furniture. The Iliad is built exactly the way living oral epic is built. It carries the fingerprints of the workshop. It was Albert Lord, the young assistant who became a great scholar in his own right, who developed the work over the decades that followed, and in 1960 he set it all down in a book called The Singer of Tales, which remains the cornerstone. And Lord's own conclusion is the one I want to leave hanging gently over your night, because people often get it backward. The field work did not dissolve Homer into a committee. Lord himself believed the evidence pointed to a singer, a real one, a master of the inherited craft, one voice of monumental gift standing at the end of the long chain, an oral poet, not a literate one, doing at the very highest level exactly what the men on the aluminum discs did on ordinary evenings. Whether Lord was right about that single monumental singer, we cannot prove, and this fireside will not pretend we can. But notice what the science did and did not do. It did not kill Homer. It changed what the name might mean. Not a man with a pen, but the last and greatest of the singers, or perhaps the name the singers gave their own perfected river. Either way, the poem stopped being an impossibility and became a craft, a human craft, practiced within living memory by men in mountain villages who never knew they were settling the oldest argument in literature. I find that the gentlest fact of the whole night, the way the Iliad was made, was not lost after all. It was in the mountains the whole time, having coffee. A river of song can run for centuries, but a river leaves no fossil. For the poems to reach us, to reach your bedside 3,000 years on, something had to catch them. And this chapter is about the net. Its story begins, of all places, with merchants. The trading people the Greeks called Phoenicians moved their goods up and down the early Mediterranean, and they carried with them a marvel, a small, fast script of letters, each sign standing for a consonant. The Greeks, trading alongside them, saw it and understood what it was worth. And somewhere around the year 800 before the Common Era, most scholars think, plausibly on the island of Euboea, where Greek and Phoenician traders worked side by side, some Greek or Greeks made the borrow, and in borrowing made one small change with enormous consequences. The Phoenician script had signs for sounds Greek did not use. Rather than discard them, the adapters gave those spare signs new jobs. They made them vowels. It sounds like bookkeeping. It was closer to lightning in a jar. A script with vowels can hold not just the skeleton of a word, but its voice, its music, its rhythm. And with that one adjustment, the Greeks had made the first full alphabet, a net fine enough, for the first time in the history of the world, to catch song. We can even hold the earliest catches in our hands. From the decades around 740 to 720, before the Common Era, the oldest surviving scraps of Greek writing come down to us, and two are famous. A scratched inscription from Athens, known as the Dipollon inscription, and from a Greek trading island off the Italian coast, a clay drinking cup that scholars call Nestor's cup, because the words scratched on it carry the name of Nestor, an old hero of the epic tradition. Stop on that for a heartbeat, because it is one of those details history seems to have arranged for bedtime. Among the very first surviving things Greek letters were ever used for, there is already a nod to a hero from the tradition of Troy. The alphabet and the epic met early. They seem almost to have been waiting for each other. That the alphabet arrived around 800, give or take, is the well-supported mainstream view, but it is a scholar's midpoint, not a birthday. What everyone can agree on are the anchors, the earliest surviving inscriptions themselves, the cup and the Athenian scratches you just met, which prove the letters were in Greek hands, and already at play by the late 700s at the latest. The only earlier Greek writing, a script called Linear B, that we will meet properly later tonight, had been an administrative tool, lost centuries before, unusable and unremembered by Homer's era. No alphabet, no written Homer. That much is safe. And the timing is suggestive in the way scholars permit themselves to find things suggestive. The alphabet appears around 800, and the likeliest window for the making of the monumental poems is the half-century from about 750 to 700. The net and the song arrive on history's clock almost together. One scholar, Barry Powell, pressed the thought to its most romantic conclusion. He argued that the alphabet was invented by a single adapter, working with a Phoenician informant, precisely in order to write down Homer's hexameters, the vowels there to carry the meter, the whole technology built for the poem. I will tell you honestly what the field makes of that. It is a minority view and a doubted one, and the critics point out that the alphabet's earliest surviving jobs are mostly humble: ownership marks, short dedications, notes of trade, not epic. But even the sober majority position leaves us a sentence worth falling asleep on. Whatever the alphabet was made for, the finest thing it was ever used for, came almost at once. How the poems actually crossed from voice to page, we cannot prove. And you now know to hear that phrase as a friend. Perhaps a great singer dictated, slowly, to a man with a pen. Perhaps a singer learned letters. Perhaps it happened more than once, in more than one town. An old report preserved by the historian Josephus, writing centuries later in the middle of an argument about record keeping, passes along the tradition that Homer left no writing at all, that the poems were preserved by memory and assembled later from the songs, and that this is why the careful reader finds inconsistencies in them. It is a report, not a record, and we will treat it as such. But it matches, in its offhand way, everything the aluminum discs would prove 2,000 years later. What we can trace is the poem's life after the catch, and it is a life of astonishing care. For centuries, the poems remained above all performances. They were carried across the Greek world by professional reciters called rhapsodes, a word the ancients heard as song stitchers, men who declaimed Homer at festivals and competitions, and through their voices the poems became something like the shared scripture of a scattered people, the book every Greek knew whether or not he could read. Athens told a story about that era, one you may meet in other tellings, and tonight it deserves its honest label. The story goes that the poems had fallen into scattered pieces, and that the Athenian tyrant Pisistratus gathered and fixed them, rescuing Homer for the world. Modern scholarship, led on this point by Nagy, reads that tale not as editorial history, but as a political charter myth, a story fostered by the tyrant's own dynasty, casting its founder as the culture hero who saved Homer, and thereby wrapping the family in the poem's prestige. The likelier truth beneath it is simpler and less flattering to any one dynasty. Athens held a great festival. The festival needed a standard Homer to recite, and the standardizing was gradual, practical, and collective. When a legend tells you a strong man personally rescued civilization, this fireside's advice, at bedtime and elsewhere, is to smile and check. The checking, in the end, was done in the greatest library the ancient world ever built. In Alexandria, in Egypt, from the 200s before the Common Era onward, the scholars of the great library took Homer up as their central labor, and 3 names stand at the head of that work, like 3 librarians on one long shift. Zenodotus of Ephesus, credited with the first scholarly edition of Homer; Aristophanes of Byzantium, a head of the library after him; and the greatest of the line, Aristarchus of Samothrace, whose work reached its height around the middle of the 2nd century before the Common Era. Copies of Homer had come to Alexandria from everywhere, and they did not agree. The Scholia, the ancient margin notes that preserve the librarian's labor, speak of superior texts and of city editions, copies kept by Massalia and Chios and Argos and Sinope and Cyprus and Crete, each proud city with its own slightly different Homer, an extra line here, a variant word there. The librarians collected, compared, weighed, and marked, line by line, through both enormous poems and the astonishing thing that we can still watch them at it. One manuscript above every other preserves the view, a great codex of the Iliad copied out centuries later and kept in Venice, called the Venitus A, its margins crowded with the accumulated notes of that ancient scholarship, and threaded through them the critical marks and judgments of Aristarchus himself. Our best text of the Iliad, the one behind the copy on your shelf, descends through that room. When you read Homer tonight, anywhere on earth, you are reading over Aristarchus' shoulder. And yet, before this movement closes, Nagy and the scholars of the multi-text school ask a question the librarians themselves might have recognized. When the copies disagreed, which reading was the original? Perhaps they suggest that question has no answer, because if the poem lived for centuries as performance, as a river, then many of the variants are not errors at all, but authentic alternate currents, moments where the river genuinely ran two ways, and there never was one single frozen original to recover. It is a view, a leading one, not a unanimity, and we will leave it exactly there, on the table by the lamp. So there is the poem's whole biography, told as honestly as the record allows. Born as voice, no one can prove from whom. Raised for centuries by singers. Caught, around the time the letters came, by a net that may almost have been made for it. Standardized by a festival, mythologized by a dynasty, and combed at last by the patient librarians of Alexandria, until it lay in the form you can buy in any bookshop on earth tomorrow morning. That is half of tonight's mystery, the poem and the man, and you have heard the verdict as it truly stands. The craft is proven, the poem is real, the poet is a name the silence kept, which leaves the other half, the city. There is a low hill in the northwest corner of Turkey, and for most of the modern age, it had no fame at all. Grain grew near it, wind moved over it. Local people called it Hisarlik, and it was a lumpy, unremarkable rise of ground, the kind of place a traveler would pass without slowing. Hold that picture, the grass, the wind, the sea light in the distance, because tonight's whole second movement lives inside that hill, and by the time we are done with it, you will never hear its name as unremarkable again. The old world, broadly, had believed. Greeks and Romans placed the Trojan War in their deep past as an event, and argued over its date the way scholars argue over any date, as we will hear near the end of tonight. But the modern age grew prouder of its doubt, and by the 1800s, many learned readers across Europe had come to file Troy, where they filed Atlantis, a poet's country, a beautiful nowhere. For the doubters, and there were many, the war was myth, the city was scenery, and looking for either with a shovel would have seemed roughly equal to excavating for the palace of Sleeping Beauty. But the doubt was never a settled verdict, and the argument stayed alive. There were always readers with maps open beside their Homer, trying to lay the poem's plain against the real coastline of northwest Turkey, and among them, the question was not whether to look, but where, and the talk circled a pair of candidate hills. One, called Bunarbeshi, had the louder friends for a time. It was the favorite. The other was Hisarlik, and it had believers of its own, quieter ones, as you're about to hear. Remember both names. Within a chapter, everything will turn on a man choosing between them. This is the argument against which everything tonight is about to happen, and the doubting side of it was not foolish. It was an honest reading of the evidence then in hand. Remember that, when the diggers start finding things. The story of Troy is not a story of wise believers defeating silly skeptics. It is a story of evidence, slowly, patiently, changing the minds of honest people, which is the best story scholarship ever gets to tell. The first cracks in the doubt were quiet, and they belonged to names history nearly lost. In 1822, a writer named Charles McLaren proposed in print that Troy lay in that hill at Hisarlik. Almost no one acted on it. The idea sat like a seed in a drawer. And then, a generation later, the seed found its gardener, and he is the man this fireside most wants to hand back his due tonight. His name was Frank Calvert. He was an Englishman living abroad, settled in the region, an amateur of archaeology in the old, honorable sense of the word, the sense that means lover of the thing. The Calvert family came to hold land that included roughly the eastern half of the mound of Hisarlik itself. And Frank Calvert, walking his own ground, reading his sources, weighing the candidates, arrived at the conviction of his life that Troy was not a poet's nowhere, and that it lay beneath his feet, inside the hill. In the early 1860s, he sank trial trenches into the mound with his own modest means. He found real antiquity, walls and remains of the Greek and Roman towns that had stood there in later centuries. But his small excavations never reached deep enough, never down to the bronze old layers where tonight's answers sleep. He had the place. He had the conviction. What his own trenches could not reach was the deep heart of the mound, and so the hill kept its secret a little longer, and the man who knew the answer stood on top of it, waiting for the kind of visitor who could dig all the way down. In 1868, one arrived. In 1868, a traveler came through that corner of Turkey looking for Troy, and he was looking in the wrong place. He was examining a different hill, a candidate called Bunarbashi that had its supporters in those years, and finding it unconvincing. His name was Heinrich Schliemann, and he is one of the most disputed human beings in the whole history of digging. And tonight you will get him honestly, the visionary and the vandal, both true at once, neither canceling the other. What Schliemann had was not patience. What he had was certainty, the means to act on it, and an absolutely bottomless hunger for the buried and the marvelous. Where the doubting professors of his day saw in Homer a beautiful nowhere, Schliemann saw an address. And in that year of 1868, his path crossed Frank Calvert's, the quiet Englishman who had spent years reaching his conviction the slow way, and Calvert did the generous thing true scholars do. He told him, in effect, not that hill, this one, come to Hisarlik. Troy is in my hill. Dig deeper than I could. It was Calvert's redirection that turned Schliemann from Bunarbashi and set him on the mound at Hisarlik. The very next year, Schliemann published a book, and in its pages the identification of Hisarlik appeared as his own insight, arrived at by his own reasoning, and Frank Calvert's name faded from the story like a figure stepping backward out of a photograph. Scholars who have compared Schliemann's private diaries with what he later published can watch it happen, the quiet rearrangement of the past, the borrowed conviction becoming a personal legend. It was the first fabrication of the Troy dig, and not the last, and this fireside will simply say plainly what a century and a half of scholarship has established. The redirection was Calvert's. The credit went to Schliemann, and Frank Calvert died in 1908, still on the edge of the story he had made possible, without official credit for the discovery of the age. Modern scholarship has been kinder. There is now a whole careful book restoring him to his place, And tonight, in this small hall of ours, he has it. When the lists of great finders are read, remember the amateur who was right first and paid politely for it. The hill was half his family's, and the idea was his gift. But now, the other half of Schliemann, because it is just as true, and the night needs it. In the 1870s, at Hisarlik, Heinrich Schliemann did the enormous thing no professor was willing to do. He actually dug, at scale, year after year, into a hill the doubters had dismissed as nothing. His first season disappointed him, and Schliemann's response to disappointment tells you the whole man. He resolved to cut a trench straight through the entire mound, a canyon through the center of the hill, deep as a house is tall, 45 feet down, and by one later reckoning, the great gash ran some 40 meters wide and 17 deep. Understand what that meant, and understand it gently, because this is where awe and grief share a bed. The hill, as we now know, was not a hill at all. It was a stack of dead cities, each one built on the flattened ruins of the one before, layer upon layer, like the pages of an enormous closed book. And Schliemann, hunting the oldest page, drove his trench through the book from cover to cover, plowing through layers without proper record keeping, without mapping his finds, destroying as he descended, and among the strata his workmen shoveled aside were portions of the very layers. We will come to them tonight, that later archaeology would identify as the closest thing to Homer's Troy the hill contains. He was looking for Troy, and in places he dug straight through it and did not know. The record has a nuance here, though, and it runs in Schliemann's favor. Later specialists who have gone through Schliemann's papers, Donald Easton foremost among them, have partially softened the caricature of a man who kept no records at all. He kept diaries with daily entries. From 1872, he was sketching objects with notes of the depths they came from, and he did, in time, come to grasp the stratigraphy, the grammar of the layers. The fair verdict is not that he recorded nothing. It is that his records were poor even by the emerging standards of his own century, and that his impatience cost the hill knowledge it can never give again. Both things are true. He found the book, and he tore pages from it. He proved there was something worth digging for at Hisarlik, city upon city. He himself came to count 7 of them, stacked in the mound, and the doubters among the professors of Europe had to watch an amateur in a hurry be righter than they were. That is the honest Schliemann, the wrong man, in some ways, for the excavation, and the only man in his generation who would ever have attempted it. And in the spring of 1873, near the bottom of his great trench, this complicated man found the thing that made him, and his hill, immortal. It was gold. On a day in the digging season of 1873, on or about the 27th of May, though even the date wobbles in the sources, late May by some accounts, into June by others, there came out of the deep trench at Hisarlik a hoard, a treasure of gold, a glitter of the kind that turns a dig into a legend overnight. Schliemann knew at once, with the certainty that was his gift and his flaw, what he had found. He was deep in the mound, in a layer ancient beyond reckoning, and the poem sang of a rich king in a doomed city, and so he did the arithmetic of the heart and named the find for all time, Priam's treasure, the gold of the king of Troy, the proof, gleaming in his hands, that the poem was true. And the story he told the world about that morning had everything. He told how he had spirited the treasure out from under the eyes of the workmen, and how his young wife Sophia had carried the gold away, wrapped in her shawl, the treasure of Troy, riding through the dig in a bundle of cloth against her heart. It is one of the most retold scenes in the history of archaeology. Sophia's shawl belongs to the legend of the field, the way the apple belongs to Newton. Now the promise kept, and I will keep it plainly. It did not happen. The shawl story was a fabrication, and we do not have to squint at the evidence to say so, because the evidence is Schliemann's own. His field notes from those very days do not agree with the tale, and the registers of his life show that Sophia was not even there. She was in Athens with her family, having left the dig about a month earlier when her father died. Schliemann himself later admitted he had invented the scene. The scholar who laid all this out, David Trail, worked from Schliemann's own diaries and letters, and even the scholars who defend Schliemann against Trail's harder judgments do not defend the shawl, so we will let it go, gently, the way we let go of a story we loved. There was no shawl, there was no smuggling wife, there was a man who had found something true and could not stop himself from improving it. Keep that sentence, because it is practically Schliemann's epitaph, and one of the morals of the whole night. He could not stop improving true things, and every improvement cost the truth a little. But the hill was not finished with him, because the hill had a correction of its own to make, and it is the best twist in tonight's story. The gold was real. The gold is real. You will hear in a moment where it sleeps tonight. But the gold was not Priam's, and could not be, and the reason is 1,000 years long. The treasure had come from very deep in the mound, from the layer archaeologists now call Troy the second city from the bottom of the stack, and as the science of the layers matured, from the 1890s onward, the truth emerged and has only hardened since, confirmed by every later generation of diggers and daters, down to the radiocarbon laboratories of our own century. Troy II, the layer the treasure came from, belongs to around 2,400 years before the Common Era, give or take a century and more. The war the poem sings, if it ever happened at all, belongs, as we will hear, more than 1,000 years later. Schliemann, hunting Priam, had dug straight past every layer where a Priam could have lived, and pulled his treasure from a city already ancient, already legend, before the Trojan War could have begun. If a king ever watched from those walls while ships gathered, this gold was as deep in his past as the Vikings are in ours. The treasure of Priam is older than Priam. As far as we can tell, no one in the story of the poem could ever have touched it. The hill, in its patient way, had out-romanced the romantic. He wanted one lost city, and it gave him a city so old it made his legend look young. Scholars still discuss quietly whether the famous treasure was truly a single hoard, lifted from one spot on one morning, or whether Schliemann, improver of true things, gathered finds from more than one place into one glorious story. The question is open. The gold is not. The gold is fact. It is the story wrapped around it that wears the question mark, which, by now, you will recognize as this man's signature weather. And the gold itself became a wanderer, and its road since is a story with no invention needed. Schliemann's treasure went in time to Berlin, acquired for the city's collections in 1881. It sat through the rise and fall of everything, and in the Second Great War, it was hidden for safekeeping in a bunker at the Berlin Zoo. And in 1945, in the last days of that war, it vanished. For nearly half a century, the world did not know where the treasure of Hisarlik was. The Soviet Union denied all knowledge of it. Only decades later did the truth surface. The gold had been flown out of Berlin from the Tempelhof airfield to Moscow on the 30th of June, 1945, and it had been in Moscow the whole time. In 1993, it was at last identified there, and in 1998, a Russian law framed its retention, after the fact, as compensation for the war's destructions. Tonight, the famous gold of Troy lies in the Pushkin Museum in Moscow, and treasure bronzes from the hill lie in the Hermitage, far from the trench, far from the poem's plain. Gold from the third millennium before the Common Era, dug up by a man chasing a poem, named for a king it never knew, hidden in a zoo, flown through a broken sky, denied, discovered, and displayed. If you wrote it as fiction, an editor would send it back as too much. It is all, every step of it, documented. So ends the first act inside the hill, a treasure with the wrong age, and a story with too many improvements, and yet, underneath both, the stubborn residue that would not go away. The mound was full of cities. Something enormous had lived and burned there, again and again, across thousands of years. What the hill needed now was not a dreamer to ransack it. What it needed was a mind that could read it. And the marvelous thing, the thing that makes the next chapter one of my favorite passages in the history of any science, is that the reader had already arrived. His name was Wilhelm Dörpfeld, and he was an architect. Hold on to that fact, because tonight it will rhyme. Twice in this story, the decisive mind will belong not to a classicist, not to a professor of the poems, but to an architect, a person trained to look at structures and see how they must have gone together, and what had to be built first, and what rests on what. Dörpfeld was a German architect and archaeologist, born in 1853, and where Schliemann had seen a hill full of treasure, Dörpfeld saw what the hill actually is, and taught the whole world to see it, a stack of cities, distinguishable, orderable, readable, if only one dug with the patience the layers deserve. One of the great archaeologists of the next generation, Arthur Evans, delivered the verdict that has followed Dörpfeld ever since, and it is affectionate and sharp at once. Dörpfeld, he said, was Schliemann's greatest discovery. Dörpfeld became a pioneer of the young discipline the field calls stratigraphy, the science of layers, and of the exact drawn documentation that archaeology had been missing, plans and sections and elevations, the architect's habits imported into the trench, dating walls by their depths and their materials, giving every find an address inside the hill. In his great campaigns at Hisarlik in 1893 and 94, and in the massive publication that followed in 1902, Troja und Ilion, Dörpfeld gave the mound its lasting shape. Not 7 cities, as Schliemann had counted, but 9, Troy the first, through Troy the 9th, stacked from the small settlements of the deep Bronze Age at the bottom to the Greek and Roman towns at the top, the very ones whose remains Frank Calvert had touched in his little trenches long before. 9 cities in one hill, thousands of years of people living, building, burning, and beginning again on the same few acres, each city standing on the shoulders of its dead predecessor. Say it slowly, because it is one of the calmest, largest facts of the night. The place was loved for so long by so many successive peoples that it became a tower of itself. And Dörpfeld's framework held. That is the mark of work done right. Blagan, the next great digger in the story, refined it and subdivided it but kept it. Korfman, the last great digger in the story, kept it still. To this day, every conversation about Troy is conducted in Dürpfeld's numbers. The only great argument left open was the one you already suspect. Which of the 9 cities, if any, was the city, the Troy of the poem? Dürpfeld had his own answer, and he backed it all his life. The 6th city, Troy the 6th, a proud fortress in the stack whose age sat close to the old traditions of the war. Hold Troy the 6th in one hand, and now let the third digger put something in your other hand. Carl Blegan was a professor of classical archaeology at the University of Cincinnati, and between 1932 and 1938, he directed its excavations at Hisarlik, the third great campaign in the hill's modern life, published afterward in 4 patient volumes. Blagan's team worked over the mound with the finer methods of a finer age, and Blagan fixed his attention just above Dürpfeld's proud 6th city, on the layer his numbering called Troy 7A, the city rebuilt in the ruins of the 6th. And in that layer, Blagan's excavation read a story in the ground, and I will give it to you exactly as the evidence gives it, briefly and gently, per the house rules. A destruction by fire, ash in places a meter thick, charred timber where roofs had come down, bronze arrowheads among the ruins, and, told softly, the remains of a few of the dead in the lanes and doorways of the city, people whom no one had stayed behind to bury. From that, Blagan drew his famous inference, and the word inference is doing honest work in this sentence, that Troy 7A had died by human violence, by capture and burning, and that this, not the 6th city, was the Troy remembered in the poem. He put its fall at about 1250 before the Common Era, a date his successors have since revised. The finer pottery clocks of later scholarship moved the burning down to somewhere around 1210 to 1180. Keep the revision, not the original. The fireside will use the newer window all the rest of tonight. So the hill, rid by 3 generations of diggers, now held 2 candidate endings, stacked one atop the other, a 6th city, grand and broken, and a 7th, humbler and burned, with arrowheads in its ash. 2 cities, 2 dooms, 1 poem. Deciding between them, and deciding what the deciding even means, is the work of the next chapter, and it brings us to the last of the great diggers, and to the quietest, strangest evidence of the whole night, a stockpile of stones that nobody ever came back for. Every city in the stack of 9 has an ending. That is what the layers are. But the 2 endings that matter tonight sit in the middle of the stack, close together, and the difference between them is the difference between the earth and the hand. Ending 1. Troy the 6th, Dürpfeld's proud fortress, comes to its close in the conventional reading of the stratigraphy around the year 1300 before the Common Era, and the favored culprit is an earthquake. The ground itself moving, the great wall shrugging, towers and houses coming down with no enemy in sight. If that reading is right, no army took Troy the 6th. It was the planet. Ending 2 is different. In the city patched together above those ruins, Troy. 7A, the signature is fire, and the fire's date, by the modern pottery reckoning you heard a moment ago, falls somewhere around 1210 to 1180 before the Common Era, with many specialists narrowing toward the end of that window, close to 1180. And around that fire has gathered the modern case, made cautiously, hedged honestly, that something in the old story is remembered truth. The man who made that case in our own generation was Manfred Korfmann, who directed the modern excavations at the hill, the Fourth Great Campaign, armed with modern instruments and, just as important, modern doubts. And before we let him speak, you need to hear the two discoveries that reframed the whole question of what Troy even was. The first came not from digging, but from listening to the ground. Korfmann's team surveyed the fields below the citadel with magnetic instruments, sensing buried walls and ditches without turning a spade, and then tested what the instruments claimed. And what emerged in their reconstruction changed the scale of the story. The famous citadel on the hill, the fortress of the Digger century, covers 2 or 3 hectares, a handful of acres, a proud but small acropolis. Below it, the team traced what they read as a whole lower town, spreading over 25 to 35 hectares, 60 acres, and more of streets and roofs and lives, sheltering, by their estimate, 5,000 or 6,000 people, and guarded at its rim by a defensive ditch cut into the living rock, 4 meters wide, 1 to 2 meters deep, followed by the instruments and the trenches for more than 600 meters of its run, first dug in the 15th century before the Common Era in the prime of Troy VI. And a ditch, patient thing, keeps its own diary. The material that slowly settled into it tells the excavators it stood open through the last proud century of the 6th city and on through the life of the 7th, silting gently toward the year 1175, which is to say, it was there, ringing the town, through every decade in which any remembered war could have come to the gate. Feel the difference in scale that all this makes. If they are right, Troy was no hilltop castle with a village at its knee. It was a real Bronze Age city among the substantial places of its world, exactly the kind of place stories fight over. And here the honesty rails, because this is a live dispute and you deserve it live. A serious dissenting scholar, Frank Kolb, looked at the same ground and refused the picture, and his objection was pointed. Troy VI, he argued, was not a commercial city and cannot even be proven to have been a city at all. The evidence for a walled lower town, he pressed, rests thinly, a stretch of stone footing only some 7 meters long. One piece of supposed town wall was re-examined in 2003 and turned out to be the cover slabs of a water channel. His own estimate of the population was closer to a single thousand. The debate between Kolb and the excavators was carried out in the journals in full public view, at full scholarly volume, and it mattered. This is how the discipline keeps itself honest. Where does it stand tonight? The ditch itself, its size and its reach and its date, is not in dispute. What it guarded, and how much city there truly was, still is, a little. But the digging and surveying done since, under Korfmann's successors, has tended steadily to support the lower town, and the field's main stream now reads Kolb's position as the skeptical minority report. This fireside gives you both, because that is the deal we struck at the top of the night. The great city is what the excavators reconstruct, and most scholars now accept. The doubt is real, named and smaller than it was. The second discovery is the quiet one, and it is my favorite piece of evidence in the entire Troy debate, because it asks you to think like a person and not like a textbook. In the burned layer of Troy 7A, along with the ash and the arrowheads Blegan had already found, the excavators recorded heaps of sling bullets, ammunition gathered into stockpiles, still lying together where they had been piled. And Korfmann drew from them a homely, devastating observation. Sling bullets are ammunition, and ammunition is valuable, and people who win a fight on their own ground go around afterward and collect it. Stockpiles left, lying in the ruins mean, in the plainest human terms, that the people who piled them did not win, and were not in a position, afterward, to tidy their city. Add the newest seasons of digging, under Korfman's successor, Rustam Aslan, whose teams in 2024 and 25 reported more of the same signature. Concentrations of sling stones, arrowheads, buildings burned, and, told gently and briefly, the remains of some who were buried in haste, and the picture in the burned layer steadies into something an honest person can describe. A real city at the end of the Bronze Age that burned, in trouble, probably in defeat. And notice, before the verdict, what makes this case stronger than any single dig could make it. 3 generations of diggers, independent of one another, keep finding the same kind of ending in the same thin band of earth. That is what conviction is allowed to look like, in a science done honestly. Now let the last digger say his verdict exactly as carefully as he said it, because Korfman was scrupulous about this to the end, and his hedges are part of the finding, not decoration around it. It is more likely than not, he concluded, that armed conflicts occurred at Troy at the end of the Bronze Age. The city of the burned layer was destroyed around 1180, probably in a war it lost. And Homer's story, he judged, is based on a memory of historical events, whatever these may have been. Whatever these may have been. Hold that phrase. It is the exact width of the truth. Not the Trojan War, proven. No banner tonight will say that. A war at Troy, more likely than not, remembered. One note of bookkeeping for the very careful, and then we will rest a moment. Korfman's own team came to file the burned city as the final phase of the Six Cities culture, a relabeling of the shelf rather than a change in the stack, and this fireside has kept the conventional numbers throughout, so that nothing wobbles in the dark. And that is where the Hill's own testimony ends, and it is worth saying softly what it has and has not given us. The Hill gives a city, real, large by the reading most scholars now accept, ancient beyond easy imagining. The Hill gives a fire, dated. The Hill gives arrowheads and sling stones in haste. What the Hill cannot give, what no trench and no instrument can ever lift out of the ground, is a name. Who burned the city, whether ships brought them, whether any singer's ancestor stood in that smoke. On all of this, the ground is silent. If the story is to go further, someone else must speak, someone from that very world, in words, and for thousands of years it seems certain no such voice existed. Then, in the 20th century, in the ruins of a forgotten empire's capital, far to the east of the hill, the voices turned up, an entire archive of them, and they had been talking about Troy, it may be, all along. Deep in the interior of Anatolia, well east of the hill by the sea, there once stood a capital called Hadassa, the seat of the Hittites, one of the great powers of the late Bronze Age world, while the cities in the stack at Hisarlik were rising and burning and rising again. The kings of Hattusa were running an empire the grown-up way, with bureaucrats and correspondents, and their scribes pressed the business of the realm into tablets of clay, letters to other kings, complaints, negotiations, the daily paperwork of power, and when that world ended, the archives stayed in the ground, waiting out the millennia, until modern archaeology found them, and modern scholarship slowly learned to read them, which means that for this one corner of the deep past, we have something the poem could never be. Mail. Actual mail from the actual world in which any real Troy would have had to stand. And in that mail, Western Anatolia keeps coming up, because for the kings of Hattusa, the West was a headache, distant, mountainous, full of small states and shifting loyalties, close to the sea, and to the ambitions of whoever ruled across it. The letters name the little kingdoms of that West, and one of them, surfacing again and again across the files, is a place the scribes called Wilusa. Say it slowly, the way you would turn a key slowly. Wilusa. Now hear the poem's own oldest breath again. We said, near the start of tonight, that the Iliad calls the city not only Troy, but Ilios, and that in the earliest Greek that name began with a sound the later alphabet dropped, a W. Not Ilios, Wilios, Wilusa, Wilios. A full century ago now, in 1924, a scholar named Fourier first pressed that resemblance, and the argument has matured ever since, gathering a second rhyme along the way, for the files also mention a nearby land called Tarwisa, which sits beside the Greek Troia, the way Wilusa sits beside Wilios. The identification cannot be called proven, and tonight of all nights, we will not call it that, but it is accepted as the general view of the field. Wilusa, the little kingdom in the northwest that the Hittite kings worried over, is, most scholars hold, the very place, the hill, the city of the layers, wearing its real Bronze Age name. And the files hold a second name, and this one faces the sea. Across the water from Anatolia, the letters speak of a power the scribes called Ahiyawa, a true power of the Aegean, substantial enough for the kings of Hattusa to deal with as a force in its own right. Who was Ahiyawa? Listen to the name once more, and then listen to the name Homer gives his Greeks, for he rarely calls them Greeks. He calls them Achaeans. Ahiyawa, Achaea. For 100 years scholars have weighed that echo, and the honest state of the question comes from Trevor Bryce, one of the great modern scholars of the Hittite world. There is still no hard proof, he writes, and yet the majority of scholars accept the equation, largely because the circumstantial evidence allows no plausible alternative. No other power of that size and shape existed across the Aegean for the letters to mean. So file it with the field. We think, on strong circumstance, that Ahiyawa is the world of the Mycenaean Greeks, the poem's Achaeans, seen from the outside, spelled by foreign scribes. If so, then in the archive of Hattusa, both sides of the Iliad are standing in the same filing room, Wilios and the Achaeans, Troy and the Greeks, in documents written while the Bronze Age was still warm. So the next question asks itself, and you already know tonight's discipline well enough to brace for the answer. Do the letters, then, record the Trojan War? They do not. What they record is in some ways better, because it has the crooked texture of the real. One famous letter, named by scholars, for a man called Tawagalawa, who appears in it, concerns troubles in that western country involving another man named Piamaradu, whose name recurs amid the unquiet of that coast. And in passing, the letter looks back to an earlier quarrel, a dispute between Hatti and Ahiyawa in the matter of Wilusa itself. There it is, the sentence scholars have read by lamplight ever after. The great power of Anatolia and the great power of the Aegean had, at some point before that letter, been at odds over Troy. But when specialists stepped back from the whole file, most recently in a scholarly forum convened in 2018, the picture the documents paint is not a single towering war. It is friction, sporadic contacts and encounters, coastal raids, ambitious middlemen, proxy quarrels conducted through local players and largely independent operators, a western frontier where the Hittite center's power ran thin. Even the fine print disagrees politely, and you may take that as tonight's reassurance that you are hearing the real state of knowledge and not a smoothed one. And the deepest caveat is conceded in print by the very archaeologists who champion the identification. Definite proof that the hill is Wilusa could only come from one thing: written documents found at Troy itself, the city's own archive, its own name and its own ground. No such find has yet been made. Until the hill speaks in writing, the equation rests on resemblance, geography, and the absence of plausible alternatives, which is to say, on very good circumstantial evidence, and not on proof. That is where it stands tonight, and where this fireside leaves it. But let the movement end on what the tablets have given, because it is enormous, and a generation of scholars would have wept to have it. A real kingdom, in the right corner of the world, bearing what is very likely most scholars now hold, the city's real name, though no tablet ever says so outright. A real sea power across the water, bearing what the majority holds, on strong circumstance, to be the Achaeans' real name. Real friction between them, over that very kingdom, raids and quarrels and letters between kings. No 10-year siege, no 1,000 ships, no wooden anything, but a world, documented, in which a war at Troy is not a fairy tale, but a plausible Tuesday. The poem, it turns out, was not describing nowhere. It was remembering somewhere. And the final movement of tonight is about how such remembering works, and what it carried, and what it dropped, across 400 years of darkness and firelight, all the way down to a shelf beside your bed. On the 4th of April, 1939, on a quiet hilltop called Epano Englianos, at Pylos in Greece, an archaeologist put his first trench into the ground and on the very first day struck writing. The archaeologist was Carl Blegen, the same Blegen, the man who had read the burned layer at Troy, spent the next spring on the other side of the story, in the homeland of the Achaeans, and what his first trench found was clay tablets, about 600 of them by the time that first day's counting was done, inscribed in a script called Linear B, which at that moment no living person could read. Tablets in that script had been known before only from Knossos on the island of Crete. Now, for the first time, they had been found on the Greek mainland, and in time, once the world's interruptions had passed and digging resumed in 1952, the hilltop would yield more than 1,000 of them, and the building they belonged to would emerge as a great Mycenaean palace of the 13th century before the Common Era, which the diggers, with a smile at the old poem that set wise King Nestor's home at Pylos, called the Palace of Nestor. And here the night hands us its loveliest small mercy, and I want you to have it in full. The palace had burned, around the year 1200, or a little after, by the same reckoning that dates the tablet's last entries. Clay tablets were never meant to last. They were the scratch paper of the Bronze Age, dried mud. But fire hardens clay. The blaze that ended the palace baked its paperwork like a kiln, bakes a pot, and so the very catastrophe that closed that world sealed its records for 3,000 years. The palace died, and in dying, remembered. If tonight needed a single image for how history survives it all, it would be that one. The fire and the archive, the ending that accidentally saves. For 13 years, the Pylos tablets kept their silence, and the man who broke it is the night's last hero, and he rhymes as promised, with an earlier one. Michael Ventris was not a professor of Greek. He was an architect, a young Englishman with a structural mind and a private, burning patience, working through the signs in his spare hours, building grids of which sign shared which position with which, on foundations laid by the careful grid work of Alice Cober before him. Groundwork, the decipherment itself acknowledged. And in 1952, the structure gave way all at once. And on the 1st of July that year, on BBC Radio, Ventris announced to anyone listening what he had found. And what he had found astonished even him. Linear B was Greek, an early form of Greek, centuries older than Homer's, written at Knossos and Pylos while the palaces still stood. The scholar John Chadwick joined him soon afterward as collaborator and first learned endorser. Their joint paper followed the next year, and the field has stood on their result ever since. The people of the Mycenaean palaces, the world the poem remembers as Achaean wrote, and what they wrote was Greek. The world behind the poem had a voice, and the voice was Greek, and an architect heard it first. Dorpfeld would have understood perfectly. Now, what that voice says is not what the romantic in all of us would order. The tablets are not poems. They are the palace's paperwork, lists and accounts and allocations, the administrative hum of organized kingdoms, and that is precisely their grandeur. They show us the world the epics remember as a real working machine. Palace centers, like Pylos, and the great citadel at Mycenae that gives the whole civilization its modern name. Kingdoms with scribes and storerooms and obligations, rich enough and organized enough to stand behind the name Ahhiyawa in the Hittite files, if the majority equation is right. Set the two archives side by side, the clay of Hattusa and the clay of Pylos, and the late Bronze Age Aegean stops being a mist behind a poem. It is a documented world, palaces here, an empire there, ships and quarrels and correspondence between, and in the middle of the sea lanes, on its hill above the ditch, the little rich kingdom that was probably called Wilusa. And then, around the year 1200, before the Common Era, that entire world went out. Tell it with awe, because awe is the truthful register. No one alive knows exactly what happened, and the not knowing is part of the record. Within a couple of generations, the palaces of the Mycenaean world burned or emptied, Pylos among them. The tablets stop. The scribal craft itself, the whole institution of Linear B, vanishes with the storerooms it served, and across the eastern Mediterranean, in the same broad horizon, old centers falter, and trade thins, and the age of bronze closes. The burning of Troy 7, remember, sits inside this very window. Whatever happened at the hill happened while the whole neighborhood was in trouble. Scholars once reached for single causes, invaders, drought, and the careful modern verdict, tested in peer-reviewed climate work in recent years, declines them all as sole explanations. The collapse of the Mycenaean way of life cannot be attributed to any single monolithic cause or event. It was systems failing together, a lattice of pressures, and climate was one strand among several, a drying trend that had strained an agricultural world already running near its limits and then sat on the recovery afterward, though, in the strangest wrinkle of the science, conditions around the destructions themselves appear to have been locally wetter, not drier. So no, the palaces were not simply thirsted to death, and this fireside will not tell you they were. Something larger and more tangled happened, the way great endings usually are tangled, And when it had finished happening, the palaces stood open to the sky. The art of writing was gone from Greek lands, and the long dusk had begun. Hold the dusk gently, because it is not only loss. Down in the villages, life went on, smaller, quieter, unrecorded. And through that dusk, for some 400 years, with no letters and no archives and no stone list of kings, something extraordinary threaded its way unbroken. And you already know what it was, because you met its heirs in the mountains of Yugoslavia. Voices, singers, the craft. Somewhere in the unlettered centuries, the memory of the great dead world, its palaces, its bronze, its ships, a war at a rich city over the water, passed from singer to singer, formula by formula, evening by evening, growing and polishing as living songs do, until the letters arrived at last to catch it. That is the bridge, the whole 400-year bridge, made of nothing but human breath and evening time. Almost everything crossing it was transformed, embroidered, reshaped, as songs are. But the tablets and the letters and the layers have shown us, one dig at a time, how much of the far shore was real. Centuries later, in the bright library city of Alexandria, where tonight has already taken you once, a scholar sat down to answer, with arithmetic, the question this whole night has circled. When did Troy fall? His name was Eratosthenes of Cyrene, and he was the kind of mind a great library grows once a century, a polymath, a measurer, the man later ages would call the founder of scientific chronology. Around the year 220 before the Common Era, in a work called the Chronographiae that survives only in quotations by later writers, he set out to build a timeline for the deep Greek past, and the method deserves a moment of admiration because he had almost nothing to build with. There was no continuous calendar reaching back so far. What there was genealogy, king lists, family lines, traditions of who fathered whom, stretching back generation behind generation into legend. So Eratosthenes anchored himself in dates he could fix: the death of Alexander, the first Olympiad of the Games, and counted backward, converting generations into years, a generation reckoned at about 40 years by the convention of the craft. From the fall of Troy, the chronographers bridged first to a fixed point of legend, the return of the descendants of Heracles. A span they set at 2 or 3 of those 40-year generations, 80 years or 120, depending on the counter, and from there they chained genealogy to genealogy, king list to king list, down the centuries to the anchors they could trust. It is, notice, a tower built downward, hanging from legend at the top. Each floor is only as sound as the family memory it rests on, and Eratosthenes knew that as well as anyone alive. And when the count was done, he set the fall of Troy 407 years before the first Olympiad of the Games, which lands, in our reckoning, on the years 1184 or 1183 before the Common Era, the 2 figures the later writers transmit from his count. Other ancient reckoners counted other chains, and the scatter tells you how honest the exercise was. Herodotus supposed roughly 1250. A carved marble chronicle says 1209 or 08, and other counters landed elsewhere across 2 centuries of answers. But it was Eratosthenes' figure that the ancient world adopted as its standard date, its official memory. Troy fell in 1184. Now set that number down beside the other one, the pottery and the radiocarbon and the burned layer gave the modern diggers, a date arrived at by methods no ancient could have imagined. on evidence no ancient ever saw, around 1180, 1184, 1180. A scholar counting generations backward through legend, and a laboratory counting atoms and sherds, arriving within a handful of years of each other, across a gulf of 3,000. I will let you feel the shiver of that, because I felt it too, and then I will tell you exactly what the scholars say it means, which is, be careful. The ancient date is not an independent witness. It is a construction, a backward count through genealogies that no one can verify, by a method whose own practitioners scattered across 2 centuries of answers. It could not confirm the dig, because it never contained that kind of knowledge, and the dig cannot confirm it, because a coincidence of numbers is still a coincidence until something ties them. The sober reading, and the one this fireside adopts, is that the nearness of 1184 to 1180 is suggestive, delicious, and unprovable, one of history's small smiles in the dark. Nothing tonight rests on it. It is simply left on the table, glinting, where honest people can admire it without leaning. And now the ledger, promised at the top of the night, paid in full at the end of it. Slowly now. There is no hurry left anywhere in this story. Here is what we know. The hill is real, and it holds 9 cities, and people lived and built there for thousands of years. In the late Bronze Age, the hill carried a real and substantial fortress town, by the reconstruction most scholars now accept, with its ditch cut into the rock and, in the reading of its excavators, a lower city of thousands. That town burned around the years 1210 to 1180 before the Common Era, and in its ashes lie arrowheads and heaps of sling ammunition that no victor ever gathered up. Far to the east, a real empire's archive names a kingdom called Wilusa in the hill's own corner of the world, and a real sea power called Ahyawa, and a quarrel between the two over Wilusa. Across the Aegean, real palaces ran a rich Greek-speaking world, and wrote and burned in the same broad hour of history. And the poem that remembers a war at a rich city called Wilusa grew from a real oral craft, centuries deep, whose working scholars have heard with their own ears and hold recorded on more than 3,500 discs of aluminum. All of that we know. Here's what we think, with the field's own confidence and no more, that Ahyawa's people and Homer's Achaeans are the same people. On circumstantial evidence, the majority finds compelling. That Wilusa and Wilios are the same place, on the same standard. That the burning of the 7th city was, in Korfmann's words, more likely than not the end of a war it lost. And that the poem, in his words again, rests on a memory of historical events, whatever these may have been. And here is what we cannot prove, and the list is precious, so keep it. We cannot prove that a man named Homer ever lived, in Smyrna or Chios or anywhere. The poems are real, the poet is a name the tradition signed itself with, and whether one monumental singer stood at the end of the chain is a question the evidence leaves open. We cannot prove when the poems were fixed in the form we read, within some 6 centuries. We cannot prove that the fire of 1180 was lit by Achaeans, or that any siege lasted any 10 years, or that a single name in the poem, Priam or Achilles or Helen, belonged to a person who breathed. The war of the Iliad, as the Iliad tells it, stands beyond the reach of every spade and every archive so far found, and it may stand there forever. That is the whole verdict, all 3 columns of it, and I want to say one quiet thing about it before the last chapter carries you down to sleep. Nothing in that third column is a defeat. An honest cannot prove is not the failure of knowledge. It is knowledge, hard won, the exact shape of the truth, as 3 centuries of patient people have been able to establish it. And it is a finer thing to hold than a comfortable legend. The way a real hill with 9 real cities is a finer thing than a poet's nowhere. We went looking for a story and found a world. The world is confirmed, and the story keeps its mystery, and both of those, tonight, are yours. So come down from the verdict now, and let the night end where the whole thing began. At a fire, in the dark, with a voice. Picture the dusk centuries, one more time, but from inside, from the warm side. The palaces are long gone. No one alive remembers them, and no one can read, and no one misses reading, 'cause the evenings are full. Somewhere on an Aegean shore, a fire is burning low, and a circle of people who have finished their work are settled around it, and a singer is in the middle of the old story, the rich city over the water, the ships, the anger of the swift-footed one, and the little crowd knows the story the way you know a road home, and wants it anyway, wants it especially, the way you want a road home. No one in that circle calls it history. No one calls it poetry. It is simply the story, the one that is true, the way songs are true. And every evening it is sung, it changes a little, the way a river changes and remains, and every evening it is sung, it survives another night. 400 years of those evenings, and not one of them recorded, and every one of them load-bearing. The greatest library of that age was a chain of human voices in firelight, and it did not lose the book. And then the letters came and caught the song, and the rhapsodes carried it, stitching by stitching, and a guild on Chios called themselves its sons and kept it, and a festival in Athens demanded all of it, and myth thanked a tyrant for the favor, and the librarians of Alexandria combed it line by line and marked their margins, and monks and scribes copied it through the long centuries, and one great manuscript came to rest in Venice with the whole ancient conversation crowded in its margins, and printers said it, and translators carried it across every border on earth, and one evening, 3,000 years downstream from the burned layer, somebody, somewhere, tired at the end of an ordinary day, reached for it on a shelf by the bed. The chain has never once broken. You are lying inside its newest link tonight. Let the images go by once more, unhurried, like the last slow procession before sleep. A hill in the northwest of Turkey, with 9 cities inside it, asleep under the wind. A ditch in the rock, 4 meters wide, tracing the shape of a town no one can quite prove, and most now believe. Heaps of sling stones, still piled, patient as evidence, never collected by anyone, keeping their one sad syllable of testimony. Gold that was too old for its own legend, glowing tonight in a museum case in Moscow, 1,000 years senior to every story ever told about it. A shawl that never carried anything, in a story a man could not stop improving. A quiet Englishman who was right first, and got his book at last, a century late and forever. An architect drawing the layers of a hill, and another architect, lifetimes later, announcing over the radio that the marks on the oldest Greek clay were Greek after all. Tablets baked to permanence by the very fire that ended their world. An archive saved by its own catastrophe. A letter in an empire's files, complaining, in passing, about a quarrel over Wilusa. A scholar in Alexandria, counting generations backward, through legend, and landing a handful of years from the laboratories of the 20th century. A coincidence smiling to itself in the dark. proving nothing, glinting anyway. Aluminum discs in a Harvard archive, holding the voices of mountain singers who never knew they were the answer to the oldest question in literature. And behind all of it, first and last, a blind man by a fire who may never have existed, singing a war that cannot be proven, about a city that turned out to be real. The Greeks themselves chose that image for the maker of the poems, and tonight you know exactly what it is, a legend, the tradition's portrait of itself, and you know why it was chosen, and knowing has only made it kinder. A singer who needs no page and no light, a memory with a voice. The poems came out of the dark of somebody's head, out of the dark of a whole civilization's long evening, and they carried the light of a lost world through it, and they made it all the way to you tonight. If Homer was one man, that is his monument. If Homer was 100 singers across 4 centuries, the monument only grows. And if tonight has left you wanting more of these rooms, 2 doors stand open just down the hall. In this catalog waits a quiet night in the great library of Alexandria, a whole slow night among the very halls where Zenodotus and Aristarchus combed the poem and Eratosthenes counted his kings. The shelves are lamplit, and nothing in that night is louder than a page. And on our sister channel, the Sleeping Almanac, the companion to this very episode, is waiting. The Odyssey, the making of Odysseus, the legend itself, told as legend, the way the singers meant it, for another sleeping ear on another night. Tonight was the history. That night is the song. They keep each other company, the way they have for 3,000 years. Your own day is done now too. Whatever it held, it is held. You do not have to carry it another step tonight. The fire here is low and easy. The sea is slow on the shore. The wind has settled, and the old story has reached the exact place it loves best, the place it was made for, a listener at the edge of sleep, letting go. The hill is quiet tonight under the turning stars, grass moving on 9 sleeping cities. The tablets are quiet in their museum cases, Hattusa's letters and Pylos' accounts, all their business finally finished. The gold is quiet in Moscow. The discs are quiet at Harvard, their singers resting. The poem is quiet on shelves beyond counting, in language after language, waiting for morning readers, in no hurry at all. 3,000 years of voices have handed the story down to this exact minute so that it could keep you company into the dark. And it has, and its work for tonight is done, and so is yours. The singer is finishing. The circle is drowsing. The fire is embers. The city is real. The song is beyond proving. And both of them, at last, at long last, are at rest. Sleep now. Good night. History will keep till morning.